"It's bad science!" they screamed angrily. Or at least I assume they were screaming. I couldn't really tell. It was in the comment section of one of my videos. Apparently, my claim that vines communicated via chemical signals and were in fact therefore sentient was wildly controversial. And to be fair, I guess Captain Capslock 99 wasn't completely wrong, because presenting anecdotal evidence is not the same as presenting scientific research that has been peer-reviewed. So like any good wine detective, I went down a research rabbit hole to try and figure out what the current scientific consensus is on how vines in close proximity to one another affect each other. So here's what we do know. Certain plant species definitely do communicate via chemical signals. This has been well documented in peer-reviewed scientific studies. However, studies on grapevines specifically are a little fewer and further between. As mentioned, there are plenty of anecdotal reports from biodynamic farmers and regenerative farmers who work with interplanted vineyards on a regular basis, insisting that when they do so, this develops some sort of ripening synchronicity amongst these mixed cultivars. And not all the evidence is from the moon-worshipping fringe of the wine world. There are some emerging scientific studies that seem to indicate that there definitely is a shifting of ripening and flowering cycles when vines are planted in close proximity to one another. Also, if we just take a look at some centuries-old interplanted vineyards in really old regions like the Douro or Alsace or Chianti or Alto Adige, then you definitely see that both red cultivars and white cultivars seem to ripen in a relatively narrow time period, which they really shouldn't. There's also more anecdotal evidence from younger interplanted vineyards in New World regions like California and South Africa. But there is a further complication. Just because there is evidence of a change in vine behavior, that doesn't prove that vines communicate via chemical signals. Because what could happen is you could have a very vigorous Carignan vine growing up and spreading its canopy right next to a more sedate Cabernet Sauvignon vine. It would then cast a greater shadow with more foliage and would change the microclimate for that Cabernet Sauvignon vine, whether it has to do with its solar radiation or really the ambient temperature. And so that Cabernet vine would change its behavior, but not because it was receiving love letters from the Carignan. In the same way, down beneath the soil, that Carignan vine can send its roots deep down and compete for nutrients in a more virulent way than perhaps a Cabernet Sauvignon vine would have, again affecting the Cabernet Sauvignon vine's ability to compete for those nutrients and thereby changing not only the physiology of the plant, but also the health of the plant. And then if we zoomed out a little bit and looked at interplanted vineyards in general, one might argue that they create a kind of unusual biome or slightly microclimate simply because they are not planted in neat little rows, and the kind of general vibe of viticulturalists and vignerons who plant interplanted vineyards is a little different to those who insist on clean, neat rows with no cover crop. And so you have a larger correlation of behaviors and attitudes that in itself would lead to vines behaving slightly differently without having received secret chemical messages from their sentient neighbors. So what is there to say on the matter? Well, we can say that allelopathy is a thing, that is chemical communication between plants. But when it comes to grapevines, it's complicated. Now we're talking about this today because today's hand drink solar wine of the day is that these Old Bones field blend made by winemaker Tremaine Smith under his label of Blacksmith wines. And this is really one of the few genuinely interplanted field blend wines available in South Africa. The fruit for this wine comes from a vineyard that was technically planted in 1977 and is technically 100% Chenin Blanc. But when viticulturalist Jaco Engelbrecht and winemaker Tremaine Smith actually started walking between the rows, they noticed a few very odd things going on. For starters, there were Cabernet Sauvignon and Cinsault vibes popping up all over the place amidst the supposed 100% Chenin Blanc, which they have since pulled out. But aside from that, just looking at the rows, it was very, very clear that this was a complete mishmash of cultivars that definitely were not all Chenin Blanc. And the whole scene looked a lot more like those super old classic European field blend vineyards that one sees in storybooks about children in golf caps. It's worth noting at this point that viticulturist Jaco Engelbrecht, who is supremely scientifically oriented and really demands rather rigorous scientific evidence before coming to conclusions, feels that while New World vineyards are usually meticulously organized, that meticulous organization robs you of some of the magic that field blends can give you. And for him to come to that conclusion, there really must be some evidence driving his opinion. So what is in the wine today? Well, seeing as we know it's not 100% Chenin Blanc, we can tell you from evidence that Jaco and Tremaine have gathered that there is Chenin Blanc, Palomino, Semillon, and Colombard. Just that mix on its own is kind of an epic history lesson in the national South African vineyard. But we can talk about that on another day. Incidentally, if you enjoy this sort of wine science history mix, then you definitely should subscribe to the Han Drink Solo YouTube channel, because we have 400 videos just like this one, and give us a like because it does help more people to find our content. We have talked about winemaker Tremaine Smith before, in that he is this amazing winemaker who started out as a chef and then converted to winemaking and then was guided and trained under masters like Andrea Molyneux and David Trafford. He also spent some time as the cellar master at the very progressive Fable Wines at this beautiful gravity-fed high-altitude cellar in Tilbach. Now he has gone full independent winemaker mode, where he spends all of his time on Blacksmith wines and he gets his tattoo artist to design his labels, or at least some of them, and he has recently settled into his very own cellar space in Riebeek West for the first time. So really, Blacksmith wines, if you haven't encountered them before, now is the right time to engage with the exciting things that are unfolding. Incidentally, if you thought both the color and flavor and aromas of this wine were mind-blowing, then you really need to taste his Guided by the Moon field blend, which goes a step further in its level of insaneness by including Grenache Noir, Grenache Blanc, and Palomino. This particularly weird interplanted vineyard was planted by farmer Johan Axton, who just felt in his gut that these cultivars belonged together. He might have said he was guided by the moon. There are other winemakers who take fruit from this vineyard and sort out the red from the white, but Tremaine felt like that would just be a waste of Axton's intuition, and he couldn't help his curiosity but to see what would become of this interplanted vineyard. And so he produced the wine Guided by the Moon, which takes all of those cultivars, Grenache Noir, Grenache Blanc, Palomino, and ferments them together. Fascinating wine. You really need to find it. When we get into the glass and give this guy a sniff, it's delightfully unusual, but it's both delightful and unusual, which I guess shouldn't surprise us really, having engaged with Tremaine and his kind of unhinged winemaking ideas. Off the bat, we get a lovely kind of citrus-driven elements of marmalade and maybe ruby grapefruit pith and even Seville orange preserve. But there's more to it as well. There's also kind of stone fruit, maybe some nectarine, and a floral sort of frangipani hint of beautiful sweet florals and slightly more earthy, almost terracotta-like notes. Now, when we give it a sip, well, this is where it gets really interesting, because you have those citrus elements that flow onto the palate, and you have some slightly more savory, perhaps oxidative style, salty, nutty notes that creep in there. But there's this rather marvelous, almost like Szechuan pepper type note, which is not anything like black or white pepper, but rather a kind of citrus zest, essential oil, tingling sensation. And I guess with Tremaine being a chef, he'd probably be quite pleased with a Szechuan pepper flavor note. But really, it's more of a sensation than it is a flavor. Beneath the rather bright kind of citrus and stone fruit, there is a slightly sweeter hint, kind of a touch of chewy peach and even marula fruit. And so those elements really do knit together quite beautifully. Bright, textured citrus, that pithy element, a touch of spice that tingles in the mouth, and then sweeter, more gentle, rounded fruit as a kind of soft base to couch all of the rest of the fascinating, arresting elements. So where does that leave us? Are field blends special? Do they produce a product in the glass that is totally unreplicable when it comes to blending cultivars manually? Well, probably, but there needs more research and a little more scientific rigor before we can say so without a shadow of a doubt. What we can say is that this wine is absolutely fascinating, and it makes me want to immediately go and hunt down its twin blend, Guided by the Moon. If you want to dig deeper into Blacksmith wines, which I really suggest you do, I have left links to 2 videos. One of them talks about Tremaine Smith's carbonic maceration pinotage, and the other is a really fascinating vintage white blend that he produced under Blacksmith wines, but with a far more classic look, his Vin Blanc 2017. And that in itself is a beautiful wine that is worth tracking down. If you can't find it, come ask me and I'll sort you out.